Um, yeah, we mentioned, and one of my graduate school professors said the key to understanding Locke was understanding what he meant by the word idea. And we saw that basically for Locke, the word idea he uses as a technical term for whatever we experience. Basically, whatever we experience gets slapped with a label of idea by Locke. But think about it. There's a difference between, I mean, I can remember what a cup of coffee tastes like, right? But there's a difference between my memory of what a cup of or what coffee tastes like, and what happens if I'm actually drinking a cup of coffee. There's a difference between my remembering the color white. Sometimes on the website, when I put information in, I want the text to be colored white. And so I click on this thing and I get a palette of about 30 different colors. And I click on white for the color that I want it to change the text to. And so I'm remembering what the color white is, but remembering what it is different from staring at that whiteboard and having a direct sensation of the color white right in front of me. And so Hume thinks that this is a distinction about our experiences that is worth making. And so Hume will talk of ideas, but for him, ideas are the copies of the original experiences we have, located in our memory and in our imagination. In other words, I just watched part of a video I took over the weekend. My friend's horse was going over fences, and I can remember what the horse looked like, but that's different from actually watching the horse in person do what it did. So Hume says, Hume basically takes Locke's category of ideas and says, look, we have the original sensations, like my experience of white, the color white when I look at the whiteboard over there. And then we have the copies of them. And so he says, well, just to back up and talk about empiricism for a slide or two. To have a clear idea of something, we need to be able, Hume says, to trace it back to a previous sense impression. So here's where knowledge being based on experience, empiricism, comes in to Hume's thinking. He says we need to be able to trace things back to an actual experience. Now, we have a clear idea of yellow because we can trace it back to a previous impression. So for Hume, we have two different kinds, and here I want to go. Frankly, I did a more detailed job of presenting Hume's views in a separate PowerPoint, and this has been on the website on Blackboard for some time, discussing one particular area where Hume advances his skeptical views, and that's the area of our confidence that we continue as the same person. In other words, you believe that you're the same person as the person who sat in this seat on Monday. But Hume is going to try to show that you cannot defend that view philosophically. And so Hume uses a particular method, sometimes it's referred to as Hume's fork, but if we understand his approach, you can kind of understand where Hume is going on a lot of different things. To get back to this idea of impressions versus ideas. So an impression, he says, they're the original sensations we get from our five senses or from reflecting internally. I could remember having a pain, say, in my shoulder, and that would be an idea, a memory of it, but actually having a pain in my shoulder now would be an impression. So they can come from within us and without. But he says impressions are more lively and forceful than the ideas, which are faint copies of them. In other words, I have a faint copy of what I remember the horse looking like, but when I was actually standing there watching the horse go, I had an impression. The impression I get from drinking a cup of coffee is different from my memory of it. So impressions are lively, forceful, whereas ideas for Hume are the faint copies of the original sensations or perceptions. And we get them, and they're located in our memory and in our imagination. He says they're less lively and less forceful. Now, here again, this seems like a really picayune little distinction. What does it matter that Hume wants to say that impressions are different from ideas, whereas Locke calls them all ideas? What rests on this? Well, the point is, Hume uses this distinction to get out a skeptical test that befuddled philosophers for 200 years after him. But just to solidify this distinction, so an impression would be actually hearing the sound of a bird, whereas an idea would be the memory you have of how a particular bird sounds, right? Actually seeing a horse or touching the horse would be impressions, remembering what the horse looked like, or imagining that you had a horse like it but a different color. Those are ideas. The actual feelings of love you have for somebody would be an internal impression. Remembering how you felt about your first love would be an idea. So what's the point of this? Well, remember, empiricism, again, is the view that all knowledge has to be based on experience. And so what he says is the original experience that knowledge needs to be based on are our impressions. And we need to be able to trace an idea that we're discussing back to a previous impression in order for it to have some foundation, in order for us to be able to defend it philosophically. Now, I'm not going to worry about this slide. The idea is that even some imaginary objects like a golden mountain are based ultimately on actual impressions, right? We've never seen a golden mountain, presumably, but we know what a mountain looks like and we know what gold looks like, and we can put those two ideas together. But now, here's the important thing. Unless you're colorblind, like my dad was, you know what you mean when you use the word yellow, right? If I were trying to change some of the text in the website to yellow, I'd pull down that color palette, and if I'm thinking, you know what, I want to change this text to yellow, I can identify, I can remember what yellow looks like. I know what I mean when I use the word yellow, and so do you. But how is it that we know perfectly well what we mean when we use a term like that? Well, we use the term yellow meaningfully, Hume would say, because we have a clear idea of the color that word is attached to. And how do we get this clear idea? Well, that idea of yellow is based on a previous sense impression of yellow. In other words, you experience the color yellow, and so your memory of what yellow was like, you have a clear idea of what yellow was like because you can trace that idea back to a previous impression. So Hume says, in order for us to use words meaningfully, and in order for us to be able to defend things and their existence from the point of view of empiricism, which says you can claim knowledge if you can, base your knowledge on experience, he says meaningful words are attached to clear ideas that we can trace back to experience, to actual impressions. So he says when you use a term, when you suspect a philosophical term is being used meaninglessly, in other words, two things are true for Hume if we cannot trace a word we use and the idea we think it's attached to, if we can't trace that back to a previous impression. We cannot defend rationally our claim as to what that thing is. And also, it's possible that the word we use is related to no clear idea, because we can't trace the idea back to a previous impression. So we have to be skeptical about what we're talking about, and we may not even know ourselves what we're talking about. So what are these terms? Well, they're words like soul, continuous self, in terms of the material world, material substance, matter, in terms of our being in a world governed by predictable scientific laws. They would be words having to do with things like a necessary connection between cause and effect that allows me to infer that the same cause in the same situation is going to produce the same effect because we live in a predictable world of science governed by fixed scientific laws. Hume says we cannot defend philosophically the existence of any of these things, and we may not even have a clear sense of what we mean when we use a word like immaterial soul. So, that's, yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. The other day you said, Plato, the real world is less than real. Berkeley and Descartes think that there's immaterial and material.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so did Plato. I mean, Socrates and Plato both think that we have an immaterial soul that continues, to exist after the death of the body.
Okay. So I'm just trying to figure out, so where does Hume, from what I'm gathering, Hume is feeling like there's no immaterial or material.
That's very perceptive. That is very good. Here's the way Thomas Reid, who criticized Hume while Hume was still alive, put it. He said, first, ideas were introduced into philosophy to explain how we perceive things, right? Locke says, I have a complex idea of the telephone, and which is what I immediately experience, and that explains how I perceive a telephone in the room via this intermediate representative image. But the problem philosophically is if the mind's only acquainted with the perceptions, what Locke calls the ideas, this is why this view was called the theory of ideas, it became very hard to defend the existence of anything but the ideas and the perceptions. In other words, claims that those perceptions gave us knowledge of the soul, of God, of a material world apart from us, became claims that we couldn't really defend. The existence of other people, also a claim we couldn't defend. And so, essentially, he says, Reid said, ideas were introduced to try to explain how it is that we perceive things in the world, but then they took over for everything, and it came to be that the only thing we could defend the existence of were these immediately perceived ideas, but whether they are ideas that represent a real material world or an immaterial self or necessary connections and things, all of these become philosophically indefensible. And you're right. Well, now, here's where Hume is different from Berkeley. Berkeley's kind of funny because he tries to convince you that his view that there's no material world is the common sense view we all ought to have. And he also says, look, I'm no skeptic. People say I'm skeptical, but he says, what is a skeptic but somebody who doubts of things? And Berkeley says, I'm not telling you to doubt whether or not there's a material world out there. I'm telling you straight out there is no material world. I'm positively asserting that there's only mind, only mental stuff. But the problem is Berkeley thought we could still defend the existence of a self, an unperceived self or soul. And he better believe that, right? He's a bishop in the Church of Ireland. He better believe that he's got an immortal soul. But basically, you're right, to get back to your question, what Hume is going to try to show is that we should be skeptical about the existence of material and immaterial substance, that we can't defend any of it philosophically. So how does he get to this point? we were waiting a while in the other class outside, but I'm going to go on. So you'll be a little ahead of the others. Okay, so here's the skeptical test Hume proposes. He says, when you suspect a philosophical term, like immaterial soul, is being used meaninglessly, here's the question you ought to ask. From what impression is that supposed idea derived? And he says, if you cannot trace that idea back to a previous impression, then the term you're using, the word, is attached to no clear idea and may have no clear meaning. And also, you can't defend the fact that that word refers to anything real. You can't defend the existence of an immaterial self or soul. So meaningless words are attached to ideas that have that we can't trace back to a previous impression. And he doesn't think we can do that with material substance. There just are the perceptions, but that those perceptions are caused by real material objects, Hume says, is an indefensible claim, because all we ever experience are the perceptions, and we can't get beyond them to the claim that there's a real material world that causes the perceptions I have that there's a real material object that my hands are touching right now, or even that my hand is a real material object. Now, some philosophers, and these would be philosophers like Descartes, but even philosophers like Berkeley. Berkeley says, well, you know, we don't have a representative idea of the soul, but we have a notion of it, which is kind of like an ongoing internal feeling that I have, that I'm a continuous self. But Hume says, come on, you know. So you say, there's no idea of the soul, but we have a notion which is supposed to be a continuous, like a continuous movie of the soul. He says, neither one of those claims can be defended. But people like Descartes and like Berkeley would say that we're continuously conscious of the self. Berkeley says we have a notion of it, that we feel its continued existence. And these were claims that Socrates made, but claims that Descartes made, that we know of its perfect identity and its simplicity. Again, that the soul is a non-compounded thing is a view that dates back to Socrates and Plato's time. In other words, it's the view, and this is a view that even Descartes had, that the soul is something like a mathematical point, that it does not have width, and it's non-composite, it's perfectly simple. One of the reasons why our body disintegrates ultimately at death is because it's a composite thing, and it's the kind of thing that can disintegrate. But for the ancients, and even for Descartes, the soul is perfectly simple and cannot by its very nature deteriorate or break apart. Now, Descartes will admit that God could put a soul out of existence. You know, you don't want to run afoul of God's omnipotence. But barring that, souls continue to exist, and also of their perfect identity through time. In other words, that we continue to be identically the same person as we were on Monday morning and as we were 10 years ago. You know. So Hume says there are some philosophers that think that we can base our claims to be or to have an immortal soul on experience. And you can see he has Descartes in mind when Hume summarizes the view of these philosophers that consciousness furnishes us more evidence for self than a logical proof. And this is what Descartes tried to say, that the surest thing he knows is that he exists as a thinking thing, as an immaterial soul or substance. And if the self is doubted, then there's no certainty anywhere, right? For Descartes, if you don't even know that you have a self, then you can be deceived or you can be mistaken about everything else. So again, in this slide, Hume's trying to summarize the views of other philosophers who think that we do have some knowledge of the soul. But Hume says there is no clear idea of such a self because we have no identifiable idea of a self that continuously exists in the way that our self is supposed to continuously exist. The self is thought to exist throughout our lives continuously and invariably and identically the same. So Hume says, where am I going to find evidence for such a self? Well, I ought to find it by introspection into my own self. He says, an impression of such a self should continue to be invariably the same the whole course of our lives. But now Hume is going to say that he cannot find an impression of such a continuous and invariable self. And so the idea is based and not traceable back to any preceding impression. So he says we don't have an impression of such a self, so we don't have an idea of such a self. And where would we find an impression of the self? Well, Hume says I would find it by introspection into my own self. And here's where we get back to the point that you highlighted. What Hume basically says is, when I look in to what I call myself, all I stumble upon are these fleeting perceptions that succeed one another rapidly and do not have a continuous, invariable existence. Right? So he says, I can only discover these particular perceptions is the word that Hume uses much in the way Locke uses ideas. Perceptions for Hume are includes the class of ideas and the class of impressions. So he says there are only particular perceptions that are discoverable. And this is a quote from Hume in the Treatise of Human Nature. When I enter most intimately into what I call myself, he says, I always stumble on some particular perception or other. And this is continuing the quote. He says, of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. But he says, all I ever have present to me are the perceptions, and I never have anything beyond them. So he says, basically, there's no impression of the self that I can discover within myself. Hume can never, by introspection, catch himself without a perception, and can never observe anything but the perceptions, which are what Locke would have called ideas. But he says all of these perceptions are in constant flux. He compares the mind to a movie, well, not a movie, but to a theater. There weren't movies back then. We're talking about the end of the 1700s. Movies were invented about 100 years later than that. So he says all these perceptions are in constant flux and change, and none of them continues invariably the same. You see what he's saying? He's saying, in order to philosophically defend the claim that I continue to exist as the same self, the same person, I ought to be able to trace that claim back to an actual experience of a soul that continues to exist invariably the same. But he says, all I ever experience are discrete perceptions. There's no impression-based idea of a constant invariable self that he can find by introspection. All he says is what I call myself is nothing but a collection or bundle of perceptions. And these are in constant movement. They succeed one another with inconceivable rapidity. And he says the mind is a theater on which these perceptions are constantly displayed. But he says there's no simplicity at any single moment. There's just this collage of different perceptions that he introspects. And there's no identity at different times. So Hume says I have to be skeptical about the claim that I can defend my claim that I'm a continuous self. Now, he has his alternative explanation, but basically it's that the self is a fiction that we sort of create, but that we can't defend. When I was in elementary school, yes, they had elementary schools around back then. You know, that was when Walter Cronkite was covering some of the first space shots, and they would herd us all into a room with a TV set, because the school didn't have many of them. And we'd watch some of these space shots, and there was one that we watched, which was a Soviet one. And remember, this is back during the days of the Cold War and the Soviet Union, and where the official state line was that religion is the opiate of the people, as Marx said, and the official state line was atheism, right? So here are these cosmonauts, and they get up there in space, and they're orbiting the Earth, and they've got the eyes of the world on them, right? So what better time to spout the state line of atheism than when you have all these people looking at the cosmonauts? So the cosmonauts, they get up there and they say, well, here I am. I'm in the heavens. I'm looking around for God. I don't see any God. Must not be any God. Well, of course, it raised the question of if there were a God, should you be able to find God outside the window of a space capsule? And if you can't, does that mean that God doesn't exist? You know, and I always think that a parallel thing is true about Hume. Hume says, well, look, if were a continuous soul or substance, or if, in order to defend that claim, I should be able to find an impression in myself of that continuous entity. And he says, when I introspect into what I call myself, all I have is these discrete perceptions. A bundle of perceptions is what I experience, but nothing continuous and invariable. But the question is that where one finds the self? And pretty much the claim that Kant made after Hume is that that's not where you find the self anyway. The self is not to be found in the field of inner perceptions. It's what has the perceptions. But in order for experience to be what it is, it has to be the experience of the same self. And so, in other words, Kant's claim is that just like the Russian cosmonauts were looking in the wrong place and in the wrong way to try to find God, we would be looking in the wrong place and in the wrong way to try to find a continuous self by introspecting into our own, minds. That's not where we find the self anyhow. The previous philosophers were wrong in thinking that we could. So at any rate, okay. I'm going to stop there. There are a few more slides on this, but we're going to probably maybe tie up a few things, and we're going to go to ethics next time. I'll probably show you a video on utilitarianism. So, did you have your hand raised? Or? These PowerPoints are in the PowerPoint folder in course documents in Blackboard. This one is called Hume on the Self. The other one is just called British Empiricism. Hume on the Self. Do you see one labeled Hume on the Self? Okay. Well, okay, hold it, folks. Wait a second here. Okay, let me turn this off. Oh, you know what? I'm glad you pointed this out. But I probably have it up for the other class. For some reason, I don't. It's only going to take me a moment to make that visible. But you're right. When I look at it from the student view, it's not there. So that's my bad on that one. But I'll make it visible to you. And I have to. So if anybody didn't get your wait a second. You're signing the wrong roll. That's the one for section 001 that the previous one to your. Somebody have the roll? Okay. Okay. There. You can sign that. Okay. Anybody need to still pick up their essay or? Okay. Hold on. Let me stop the recording.